Good afternoon, and welcome to Prime Time at the Bethel University Library. Prime Time is a collaboration between the Friends of Bethel University Library, Academic Affairs, and other offices on campus that celebrates learning in and beyond the classroom of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. We archive videos of past presentations. If you'd like to explore them, you can find them on the Bethel University Digital Library YouTube channel or in the Spark Digital Archive. Today, I'm delighted to welcome you to an Edgren Scholars presentation on our last prime time of the year. The Edgren Scholars program supports faculty-student research teams as they collaborate on a research project. The project must be one that has the potential to make a significant contribution to a given field of study, and the project must reflect meaningful collaboration on research between students and faculty. The Edgren Scholars program is named after John Alexis Edgren, the founder of what is now Bethel University. One of the key educational principles that Edgren articulated in the 19th century was that, quote, the relation between teachers and pupils shall not be that of commander and subject, but one of true friendship and helpfulness. It is in this spirit that we established the Edgren Scholars program in order to encourage and facilitate students and faculty working together. Dr. Sherryse Corrow, professor of psychology, and political science major and psychology minor graduate Ian Young are one such Edgren team. Dr. Corrow and Ian spent last summer examining the relationship between face blindness and ADHD. We're excited to learn more about their findings. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you so much for having us and giving us the opportunity to talk about some of this work that we've been doing. This is actually kind of a 2-for-1 deal because in the fall I was on sabbatical. And so I'm going to be describing to you first some of the work that was related to that sabbatical. And the reason why I'm doing that is because it's that work, the preliminary results of that work that led into the Edgren project. So one kind of led to the next. So if you're not aware, so I've been doing research on developmental prosopagnosia for approximately 15 years. And developmental prosopagnosia refers to a lifelong deficit in face recognition despite normal general memory and intelligence. So when someone has prosopagnosia, they'll tell you that they have a really difficult time recognizing familiar people in their life, despite the fact that they don't have problems recognizing other kinds of things or remembering other kinds of things. Okay, so developmental prosopagnosia can be a real, it can be a very significant logistical challenge for someone. So say you're working in your job or something like that, and your boss comes up to you or someone comes up to you and says, can you please deliver this to this person? Or someone comes up to you and says, can you please get me such and such report by the end of the day? And they walk away and you're going, I have no idea who that was. For a parent, picking up their kid at school can be really challenging, right? They pull up and they maybe don't recognize their kid among all of these other ones. And so they develop all these kind of little strategies, like I'm gonna stay by the car, I want you to come and find the car, instead of I'm gonna come and find you. But there oftentimes are concerns about, if I get separated from my kid, is it gonna be easy for me to find them? Things like that, okay? I do have a few quotes for you here. From people with prosopagnosia. So prosopagnosia, face blindness. It means my brain doesn't process human faces in the same way others do. I can't recognize faces, so I have to memorize distinguishing features instead. And so I do really think that captures the experience of many people with prosopagnosia. They'll tell you, when I meet someone, I'm immediately trying to catalog things in my brain. I'm making kind of a mental list in my head of if I see a person again that has kind of a slight mole in one location or something like this, or a particular way that they move, and they're trying to make a mental note of these things should they need them again in the future. The second quote, recognizing faces when you have prosopagnosia is like recognizing donuts by their sprinkles. Okay, another analogy that I've heard is that trying to recognize someone by their face feels for me like how you might feel if you've been asked to recognize someone by their hands. Okay, and so maybe you can see differences between them, but being able to use that information to identify a person might feel really, really challenging. Okay, and then the third one, I knew everyone without really knowing anyone, save a handful of best friends and a boyfriend, all of whom tended to be visually distinctive or at least very loud. It never occurred to me that this might be a strange way to live. So I think that last quote really captures the idea that a lot of people with prosopagnosia go well into life before they realize that other people recognize others by their faces, right? It's not something that we talk about. You know, when Kathy Nevins shows up today, I didn't look at her and be like, hey, Kathy, it's good to see you. Hey, I recognize you by your face. Like, we don't say these kinds of things. It's just something that we do intuitively, and we assume that everybody's doing it the same way. But without the context of those conversations, it's pretty easy to make the assumption that other people are also trying to remember clothing, hairstyles, moles, things like that, or particular distinctive features. Okay. So some really common questions that are leading the field, that have really dominated the field for a long time. One question has been, in cases of prosopagnosia, why is it that they're not recognizing faces, right? Or so like, what aspects of face processing aren't working that's leading to impaired face recognition? So here's some examples of article titles. So developmental prosopagnosia, a window to content-specific face processing. What aspects of face processing are impaired in developmental prosopagnosia? So on and so forth. Tons and tons and tons of studies that are asking this question. Another really big question that has dominated the field is whether or not prosopagnosia is actually specific to faces, right? Like, is it the case that truly these folks can't recognize faces, but they can recognize everything else fine? And the reason why that's a really, really important question is that faces are arguably the visual stimulus for which we have the most expertise, right? We see faces all the time. We distinguish between people all the time. We are effectively experts in face processing. We aren't, other than a few exceptions, like I don't need to distinguish this couch from this one right here, or that green chair from that green chair, right? I can potentially find slight differences between them, but that's not something that's essential for my life. But recognizing faces is something that emerges as being a really essential skill. So outside of recognizing faces, we need to be really good at that. The next closest thing for visual expertise is probably reading. Okay, so lots of people have asked, is it the case that people with prosopagnosia just can't recognize faces? Or is it the case that they also have deficits in recognizing other kinds of objects like cars in a parking lot, or one house versus a different house, or written words, things like that? But they just don't notice because those are things for which we don't need as much expertise, right? So maybe the deficit is there, but we don't know it. So lots and lots of studies that have asked that question, like, is there an overlap between these things? Okay. But in more recent years, there's been some studies that have come out that have shed some light on a few new things. So one, there's been more and more studies all the time that have showed other conditions that also have a face recognition impairment with them, okay? So some example of that, lots of studies on autism spectrum disorder. That's not a new thing. Actually, that research has been going on for a really long time. But more recently, developmental motor coordination disorder. There's a study that came out demonstrating face deficits in that group, which kind of leaves us all puzzling a little bit. Like, why, if you have like kind of a motor coordination disorder, why might that be related to face recognition? Schizophrenia is another one that oftentimes is associated with face recognition impairments. And then some of my own work, and then also work from other labs, showing that people with congenital amusia, which is a fancy way of saying tone deafness. So people who have a really difficult time distinguishing between different musical pitches have been demonstrated to have difficulties with face recognition as well. But that's other disorders that show deficits in face recognition, but you can flip that the other way as well. So you can ask, if we look at people with prosopagnosia, what kind of other deficits do we see in those cases? So things that often tend to show up, visual disorders. So topographic disorientation is a fancy way of saying they get lost easily, right? Being able to navigate from one place to another without getting lost. In cases of acquired prosopagnosia, so that's when you have brain damage that results in prosopagnosia as opposed to just being born with it. topographic disorientation is very common because the face areas and the navigational areas of the brain are really close to one another. So if you have an injury that affects one, it's very likely you have an injury that affects the other as well. Object agnosia. So that's a fancy way of saying they have a difficult time recognizing other kinds of objects. So some things that have come out about that, but a lot of inconsistency. Some studies saying, no, people with prosopagnosia can recognize objects just fine, and others saying, no, they can't. If you look at it in just the right way, then we see some deficits. And then impaired body perception, so that's an interesting kind of parallel. But then also other modalities. So again, congenital amusia shows up. So in some of my research, we demonstrated that people with prosopagnosia had a difficult time with pitch processing. So being able to differentiate one pitch from another. So that kind of research more recently has kind of led us to think, have we been missing the forest for the trees a little bit? Have we been so focused on trying to understand whether or not face and objects are separate from one another, or trying to understand like what aspects of face processing are impaired, that we failed to kind of like take a step back and look at the bigger picture of what are some of the disorders that are related to prosopagnosia and where you see some overlap, and might those disorders give us some clues as to what's going on with prosopagnosia. Okay. So for some of my sabbatical work, the guiding questions involved, given that we know that developmental prosopagnosia tends to occur with some other disorders, the first question is, could some of these common comorbidities between face recognition and other disorders give us some clues as to the mechanisms or processes that are involved in face recognition or in prosopagnosia? And then second, could those comorbidities, which just means another way of saying disorders that occur together, could they shed light on some of the developmental progression of these underlying disorders? Okay. So one of my collaborators, and so Randy Starfelt is at the University of Copenhagen. So for my sabbatical, I actually went out to the University of Copenhagen and spent some time with her in her lab, talking and thinking through a lot of these kinds of things. She had recently done a study where they looked at some comorbidities in her group of subjects. And in that group, 57% of her group with prosopagnosia reported comorbidities of some kind. Okay. Among those, the most common of which were synesthesia. So this is when you have kind of linked sensory experiences. So for example, every time you see the letter A, you might also experience the color red. Okay, so it's like these sensory experiences are linked with one another. As I mentioned, navigational difficulty. Aphantasia is a disorder that characterizes difficulty in visual imagery. So somebody with aphantasia might say something like, wait a minute, you can like imagine things in your head and they have a visual element to them. And that's kind of like a mind-blowing thought, right? So they'll tell you like, I can't visualize anything, okay? And then some people also reported some challenges with memory. The most common thing that appeared from that study was cognitive impairment. So they were most likely to report object agnosia, memory problems, navigational problems, but 25% of them reported those kinds of things. But one thing they noted is that there was a lot of variability, right? So they didn't see something that emerged very consistently across people. They had lots of individual differences. So an important thing about that study is that they just kind of looked at the group with prosopagnosia generally speaking, but they didn't compare to a non-prosopagnosic control group, right? So that was one of the things that I wanted to ask as part of my sabbatical research. So are those with developmental prosopagnosia more likely to report other kind of developmental conditions than those without prosopagnosia? And if so, what are those disorders that emerge? Okay. So for this preliminary study, we had a group of 78 people with developmental prosopagnosia, self-reported. This was an online study, and 62 control subjects. As you can see from this image here, we have a lot of women in this study. We tend to get women in these kinds of studies because they're just a bit more likely to participate. Right? And we asked them about a bunch of different disorders. So this was, as a first preliminary step, this was a very self-report kind of study. So we asked them about several different cognitive disorders, different developmental/learning disorders, and different psychiatric disorders as well as oral motor disorder and color blindness. And for each of those disorders, we asked them 2 questions. The first was, have you ever been diagnosed with fill in the blank? But we also wanted to recognize that some of these disorders are things that are really, really hard to come by an actual diagnosis. Prosopagnosia is a great example of that. There's very few doctors who feel comfortable giving a prosopagnosia diagnosis. And there's other disorders like that as well, synesthesia being one of them, congenital amusia, that would be another one. So there's lots of things like that. So we asked a second question, which is, if you haven't received a diagnosis, do you believe that you should have received a diagnosis or that you should be diagnosed with this disorder? So that we could just try to get a sense of what people suspect that they might have. That also allowed us to take into account some of the differences across time in how some of these disorders were diagnosed, right? We diagnosed things like ADHD and autism at a different rate than we once did, right? And our participants came from a whole variety of ages. So we wanted to take that into account as well. Okay, so the big story here, right? So first we asked, do those with developmental prosopagnosia report more disorders than people who don't have prosopagnosia? Importantly, we're asking them, how many disorders do they report outside of prosopagnosia, right? Our control subjects, 64% of them reported 1 or more disorders. That might seem like a really high number, so I can come back to that if you're interested in having an additional conversation about that number. And our developmental prosopagnosia group, 88.5% of them reported having a disorder outside of prosopagnosia. Okay, and that was a significant difference between those 2 groups. We also asked, just kind of generally speaking, how many disorders are they reporting? So our control group reported on average 1.47 disorders outside of prosopagnosia, and our developmental prosopagnosia group reported 2.5 of the disorders that we asked about on average. Okay. Then, of course, we also wanted to ask questions like, what kind of disorders are they reporting? Okay. Oh, sorry, one more thing I wanted to say about this. One thing that you might ask if you're looking at this kind of data here, one thing you might ask about is maybe this developmental prosopagnosia group is either a little bit more likely to think that they have a disorder, perhaps, or they're a little bit more in tune with what's going on with like their cognitive ability, right? They might just have like an extra level of awareness that maybe some other people don't have, okay? If that was the case, you might expect that they would be more likely to report all different kinds of disorders, right? But that's not actually what we found. What we found is that they were more likely to report cognitive disorders relative to the control group. They were more likely to report developmental learning disorders relative to the control group, but they were not more likely to report psychiatric disorders relative to the control group, just generally speaking when we collapsed across those different types of conditions. Yeah. Okay, so in terms of what they're reporting, if we're comparing our developmental prosopagnosia group with our control group, we found that our developmental prosopagnosia group was more likely to report synesthesia, topographic disorientation, and aphantasia. That was very comforting to me because that's something that we've seen evidence of in the literature before, right? That there's kind of some association between those kinds of disorders. And it's also consistent with what Randy Starfelt had found in Denmark as well. Okay. When it comes to our kind of psychiatric disorders, the developmental prosopagnosia group was actually less likely than the control group to report generalized anxiety. Okay? So I can come back to that again when I get to a further slide. But all the other differences were not significant. And then when we asked about developmental or learning disorders, ADHD was the only one that emerged, where our developmental prosopagnosia group was more likely than our control group to report ADHD. Okay, and then in terms of our oral motor disorder, color blindness, and schizophrenia, there was no differences between the groups for those 3. Okay. An interesting point to note, though, is that when we ask them, not what have you been diagnosed with, but what do you think you should have been diagnosed with? So what do you suspect you have? Then we found significant relationships between social anxiety, That's really not surprising. People with prosopagnosia often do have social anxiety. They're very nervous about somebody approaching them and going, hey, how are you doing? It's really great to see you. And they have no idea who they're talking to, right? Autism spectrum disorder then emerged. That's another one, not surprising. There's been a strong link between face recognition and autism spectrum disorders for a long time. But then another one that emerged that was a little more surprising was sensory processing disorders. So that would be something to look into in the future. Okay. So lastly, we asked, what of these disorders best predicted whether or not someone reports having developmental prosopagnosia, right? And so that's what you see here, where basically the length of the line indicates it's better at predicting, okay? And so ADHD actually emerged as the strongest predictor of whether or not somebody had prosopagnosia, followed by topographic disorientation, social anxiety, that reverse generalized anxiety disorder, and aphantasia. Okay, so that generalized anxiety disorder, if you had generalized anxiety disorder, you were less likely to indicate that you have developmental prosopagnosia. I don't have any reason to believe that, that prosopagnosia makes you less generally anxious than other people. I think most likely what's going on here is that those who do have developmental prosopagnosia are very focused on the social anxiety piece of it. And because they're very likely to report the social anxiety here, and that's kind of the focus of their concerns about anxiety, that they're perhaps less likely to report this one. But that's just my hunch at this point in time. Okay, so what can we conclude from this first study? One, in developmental prosopagnosia, comorbidity or kind of co-occurring disorders seems to be the norm rather than the exceptions. Most people with prosopagnosia are reporting that they have at least one other thing. Okay? We did observe more comorbidity in developmental prosopagnosia than we did in a general control group. Okay? Which leads us to believe that maybe prosopagnosia is part of a larger developmental syndrome that's affecting many different types of systems, right? And that was kind of the whole goal of doing this to begin with, is kind of thinking about, is there a bigger story going on here that we're potentially missing, okay? And so this was really intended to be kind of a jumpstart for thinking about, if we were going to look into comorbidities, what things should we be looking for? And so we wanted these comorbidities to guide future investigations, right? And then also recognizing that face recognition might be involved in a very wide range of disorders, and therefore we shouldn't be overlooking those things when we're thinking about those disorders. So on that note, I'm going to hammer home this point right here, this idea that comorbidities should guide future investigations. That ADHD piece was something that surprised us a little bit. That's not something that's been demonstrated in the literature before. It's a finding that would need to be replicated if that's the case, that there actually is an association there. So that was the motivation for doing the Edgren project with Ian. And so I'm going to hand it over to Ian so he can talk about that project. Sorry.
All right, it is good to be back. So the central questions that we used for study 2 were, do those with ADHD have difficulty recognizing faces? Do those with prosopagnosia have greater symptoms of ADHD? And do face recognition and attention abilities correlate? Dr. Corrow talked about this a little bit during her study that she did during her sabbatical. And so this study acts as an add-on to that, so we can get a better understanding of the impact that ADHD has on prosopagnosia or vice versa. And so these were the 4 groups of participants that we decided to focus on. So DP, developmental prosopagnosia, ADHD, ADHD controls, which means those with ADHD symptoms were excluded from this group, and general controls, which was more diverse and was more inclusive to people who might have developmental prosopagnosia or ADHD. And so for each of these groups, we aimed at having 100 or more participants, but difficulties with recruiting participants on social media prevented us from getting to that goal, and we had to settle with these numbers. And so when discussing the methods/stimuli that we used, we primarily use the Cambridge Face Memory Test, or the CFMT, which is a 72 picture trial where a participant is exposed to 3 or more faces for a few seconds, and then they are tasked with remembering those faces. And then the rest of the trial involves them trying to see if they can recognize the right face that was shown in that previous slide. And then we use the Cambridge Bicycle Memory Test, also known as the CBMT. This was following the same principle as the CFMT, except we used bicycles as a way to test or assess the object recognition of the participants. And then finally, we used the ACID-BS, which is a survey that assesses the severity or non-severity that ADHD has on the participants. So for example, if they have a significant problem with attention span or a significant problem with forgetfulness, they would choose 6. And if they didn't, they would choose a number lower than that. And so that leads to our first question that we were trying to answer. Do those with ADHD have difficulty recognizing faces? And so with this question, we used a 2-sample independent t-test to see if there was a significant difference in CFMT scores between those with ADHD and those without. And so in this slide, you can see that ADHD was compared with ADHD controls, or those that were excluded for having ADHD symptoms. And our final result ended up showing that there was no significant difference in CFMT scores between those with ADHD and those without. And this is just some of the statistics or results that we were able to get from that. For the second test that we ran, we wanted to compare the 3 subtypes of ADHD, so inattentive, hyperactive, and combined, with the ADHD controls. And it was a similar result where there was no significant difference in the CFMT scores between different types of ADHD and those without. Leading to our next question, do those with prosopagnosia have greater symptoms of ADHD relative to the control subjects that participated in the study? And so we wanted to see if the ADHD DP, developmental prosopagnosia, the DP control group, and the ADHD control group had a difference or a similarity in their ADHD symptoms. And we actually found that the DP group was similar to controls in terms of their ADHD symptoms. And so that's what we were able to find with that specific test. And finally, do face recognition and attention abilities correlate in any way? And so we used a standard correlation test to assess whether or not those better at recognizing faces, or those who had a lower CFMT score, ended up showing fewer symptoms of ADHD. And our last result for this was there was no significant correlation between the CFMT score and the total ADHD score. So it's kind of scattered all over the place, but it gives you an idea of what the final results were like.
All right. I remember when I was a PhD student, I asked my PhD advisor, like, what happens if my results don't come out significant? And I remember very clearly he said, you are not responsible for what the participants do. And I was like, okay, good. So anyways, in perhaps a rather anticlimactic results, right? We found that the ADHD group did not struggle with face recognition, at least in this particular sample. And also that our DP group did not exhibit elevated ADHD symptoms relative to their respective control group. So the take-home message then, and one more, and that the ADHD symptoms and face recognition scores did not correlate with one another in this particular sample. So the take-home message, and I'm speaking it largely to the undergraduates here, actually, is that sometimes you don't find what you expect to find. And that's really, really okay, right? And so I put this little note here that one of the things that I really love about working at a place like Bethel, as opposed to maybe a larger research institution like the University of Minnesota, is that I don't feel hugely compelled to make sure that I have significant data or something really groundbreaking, because I'm not like super fearful of not getting tenure or something like that should that not happen. And so I don't feel compelled to make up my data, which is really nice. So anyways, but also a point that this is the power of replication. This is why you replicate findings, right? So in our initial study, we had this thing emerged. It seemed to be the strongest thing. And so then we followed after that because it was a preliminary finding. It was something that hadn't been done before. Come after it with a second study and ask, is this a real thing? And we didn't find evidence for that. And so I think that it really shows like why you need to do that follow-up study. Yeah, great. That's all we have for you. Thank you so much for being here. Oh, and I just want to say one more thing. I'm so grateful for Ian. He worked so hard this summer. I was like in the process of getting ready to do all the sabbatical work and things like that. And he was just completely on top of recruiting participants and making sure that we had everything going smoothly, working with things that sometimes technical challenges that were really a pain in the butt. And he absolutely powered through and was able to get a really good, decent sample size despite some of the technical challenges that happened. So he did a great job. So nice job, Ian. Questions? Yeah.
Do you think for the second study you found null results because you had more specific and better measures, right? Before you're just asking them what they think. Mm-hmm. Here you kind of demonstrate what you can do, and it's actually a specific measure as well on the attention and the other. Yeah,
absolutely. The first study was 100% based on self-report. And so I do think it calls into question really thinking about so like I had that initial comparison. We thought, well, maybe people are just kind of more likely to report that they have stuff if they have prosopagnosia. Yep. And so we didn't, we found that they were more likely to report, these kinds of disorders, but not kind of psychiatric disorders. But I do think it kind of calls into question a little bit, maybe the degree to which people might be a little bit more in tune or maybe a little bit more likely to believe that they have some of these things. Yeah.
I was just thinking if some disorders are along a spectrum or they have different subtypes. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder, and I apologize if I missed this, but with respect to ADHD, there is the primarily inattentive and the primarily hyperactive. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if some of those nuances may be lost if just the name of the disorder, because it could differ significantly.
Yes. So that could be true, especially with regards to our first study. Sorry, I went back too far. So this, do you want to answer this one? Go for it. Okay. So this was kind of our goal of doing this one here, is trying to break this down into thinking, because maybe there is a little bit of nuance here. And then not only that, but trying to correlate ADHD symptom score with face recognition score to kind of see like, well, maybe if we're talking about dimensionality of these, maybe if you have more extreme ADHD symptoms, you would be more likely to have impaired face recognition. But that was also why we wanted to do this analysis, was to try, and the averages do go in the order that we expected. The initial hypothesis was that the ADHD controls would have the best face recognition scores, followed by the hyperactive group, because you wouldn't expect them to have as many inattentive symptoms, followed by these two groups kind of comparatively being the same because they both have inattentive elements to that type of ADHD. And so And there is like a teeny tiny downward slope there, but as you can see, not anywhere close to being significant. Yeah.
Oh, is there, like, what's kind of the next, like, step for this research? Is there, like, another disorder that you're going to try and, like, connect it to, or what's the future of this?
Yeah, there is a long list of next steps. There's always a long list of next steps. But one thing, I do think it might be interesting to look at sensory processing disorder, because that was another one that emerged that hasn't been demonstrated. So chasing after that a little bit to see if there's something to that. Sensory processing disorder historically is also kind of a little bit challenging to define in some ways. And so it feels like a little bit messier road to go down. But then there's also, I mean, literally just yesterday, I got a new meta-analysis that came out about prosopagnosia and dyslexia. So there's new things coming out all the time. Dyslexia wasn't something that emerged from this particular study, but other people are finding it in some ways. And so it could be that some of these effects are rather small, and that in order to detect them, we would need really, really large sample sizes in order to get at them. But yeah, I think there's lots of avenues to go down. To be honest, my first avenue is going to be really just taking a deep dive into the literature to see what's out there and trying to organize it all in a way to package it together in something that's publishable, to just kind of bring everyone up to speed on this topic. Like, where are we at? So that's the summer project.
It makes me wonder when you say about dyslexia. One of my friend's kids had been diagnosed with dyslexia, but it was the eyes and how the eyes work together. Have there been studies regarding that, the visual part of?
Yeah, so the biggest stuff that's come out that would be related to kind of like coordination of the eyes working together is often related to kind of really, really early visual disorders. So for example, kids who are born with congenital cataracts, right, that don't have like a great rich visual experience early on in life are more likely to report difficulties with face recognition. I don't have any, I'm not aware of any research that connects face recognition with strabismus, which is what you're describing. But that doesn't, like I said, like up until recently, there hasn't been research that's been looking at comorbidities. And so to me, like in some ways, everything is kind of fair game, right? And then when we do find comorbidities is likely to be for different reasons, right? Like the reason why there's a connection between autism, spectrum disorders, and face recognition could be a completely different reason as to why there's a connection between face recognition disorders and dyslexia, for example, right? They could be separate. Yeah. Other questions?
I've never thought of synesthesia as a disorder. So was it more just because it's easy to put it within that category, or do you or some people think of it as a disorder?
Some people definitely think of it as a disorder. Yeah, on the grounds that, so like in my sensation and perception class, actually sometimes I invite synesthetes to just talk with the class in Zoom, and we have a conversation. And some of those individuals will tell you like, no, it is so disruptive, right? Like when I'm playing music in the car, and as a result of this music, I'm having this rich visual experience. Like I can't drive in the car while having the music on. Or it's so distracting. Like if I'm trying to have a conversation with someone and music's playing and there's these like cacophony of lights happening, it's too much. So yeah, I do think there's definitely people who would describe, but it's probably better described as a condition than disorder, perhaps. Yeah. Other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here.